Family Feud history had never seen this before. Steve Harvey stopped mid-joke, dropped the microphone to his side, and started walking toward a contestant. The studio fell into absolute silence. The cameras kept rolling, but nobody knew what to do. This wasn't part of the script. This wasn't rehearsed. This was the moment when entertainment became something far more profound. The woman standing at the podium couldn't hold it together anymore. Her shoulders were shaking. Her family members behind her stood frozen, unsure whether to move or stay. The audience, who had been laughing just seconds ago, now sat in stunned silence. And Steve Harvey, the man known for quick comebacks and infectious laughter, was walking toward her with an expression nobody had ever seen on his face before. What had just happened? What had this mother said that made one of television's most charismatic hosts abandon his role entirely? The answer would break hearts across the world and reveal a side of Steve Harvey that cameras rarely capture. But to understand this moment, we need to go back to the beginning of that day. Back to when this was supposed to be just another episode of Family Feud. Just another round of laughs, buzzers, and families competing for cash prizes. Nobody in that studio, not the producers, not the crew, not even Steve himself, knew that they were about to witness something that would transcend television. The Henderson family had arrived at the studio that morning with a story that most families carry in silence. Patricia Henderson, a 52-year-old mother from Ohio, stood with her daughter, her sister, and 2 nephews. They were there to play the game, to maybe win some money, to have a moment of joy. But beneath the smiles and the game show excitement, Patricia carried a weight that no mother should ever have to bear. 6 months earlier, her son Michael had lost his battle with leukemia. He was 19 years old. A sophomore in college. A kid who loved basketball, who wanted to be a teacher, who had spent his final weeks telling his mother that everything would be okay. That she would find joy again. That she would laugh again. And one of his final wishes was simple. He wanted his mom to go on Family Feud. It was their show. They watched it together every night during his treatment. Steve Harvey's humor had been their escape during the darkest months. So here she was, fulfilling a promise to a son who would never see her on that stage. The producers knew part of the story. They had been briefed that this family had experienced loss. But they had no idea what was about to unfold. Because Patricia Henderson had kept something close to her heart. Something she hadn't shared with anyone except her family. Her son's final words. The last thing he said before he closed his eyes for the final time. The game started like any other episode. Steve did his signature entrance, making jokes, getting the audience warmed up. The Henderson family was matched against the Rodriguez family, and the energy was exactly what you'd expect. Buzzers ringing, answers flying, Steve doing his classic double takes at ridiculous responses. Patricia was smiling. Her daughter was laughing. For a few minutes, it felt like maybe this would just be a normal, joyful experience. But then came the question that changed everything. Steve looked at his card and read, "Name something a parent never stops worrying about, even after their child grows up." It was a standard Family Feud question. The kind asked 100 times before. But for Patricia Henderson, it was a door she hadn't expected to open. She hit the buzzer first. Steve walked over with his microphone, that trademark smile on his face, ready for whatever answer she'd give. "Patricia," he said warmly, "name something a parent never stops worrying about, even after their child grows up." Patricia opened her mouth to answer, but something happened. Her voice cracked. Just slightly. Just enough for Steve to notice. Their safety," she managed to say. The answer was on the board. Number 2. The family cheered. Steve started to move on to the next contestant. Standard procedure. Keep the game moving. But then Patricia did something unexpected. She reached out and gently touched Steve's arm. "Steve!" she said quietly, but the microphone picked it up. The studio heard it. Steve turned back, and in that instant, his entire demeanor shifted. He could see it in her eyes. This wasn't just a game show answer. This was something real. Can I say something?" Patricia asked, her voice trembling now. The producers in the control room tensed. This wasn't protocol. Time is money in television. They have a schedule. But Steve Harvey didn't hesitate. He stepped closer to Patricia, gave the slightest nod to the crew to hold, and said 2 words that would define this moment. Of course. What happened next would be played millions of times across social media, shared in grief support groups, and referenced in interviews about the power of human connection. Patricia took a shaky breath and said, I lost my son 6 months ago. He was 19. And his last words to me were, Mom, promise me you'll still laugh. The studio went completely silent. Not the polite quiet of an audience waiting for the next joke. The profound, heavy silence that falls when something sacred enters a space. Steve Harvey, who had been holding the microphone, slowly lowered it to his side. His smile was gone. His eyes filled with tears. And then he did something that producers would later say they had never seen him do in 20 years of hosting. He walked away from his mark. He stepped away from where the host is supposed to stand. He walked directly to Patricia Henderson, opened his arms, and wrapped her in a hug. The cameras kept rolling. The audience began to cry. Patricia's daughter collapsed into her aunt's arms. And Steve Harvey, the comedian, the entertainer, the man who makes millions laugh every week, stood on that stage holding a grieving mother and wept with her. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Behind the scenes, something extraordinary was happening. The producers had a decision to make. Stop the tape. Move on. Reshoot this segment without the emotional moment. Keep it light. Keep it on brand. But one producer, a woman named Janet who had worked with Steve for years, made a call. She picked up her walkie-talkie and said 5 words. Let him do his thing. And they did. Steve didn't let go immediately. He held Patricia like she was his own family. When he finally stepped back, he kept one hand on her shoulder and looked directly into her eyes. What was his name? He asked softly. Michael, she answered. Steve nodded, took a moment to compose himself, then turned to the audience. Y'all, we're not just here to play games. We're here because we're human beings. And Michael's mama is standing here honoring her son's last wish. So we're gonna honor that with her. The entire studio erupted. Not in applause, but in something deeper. A collective exhale. A recognition that they were witnessing something rare and true. The other family, the Rodriguez family who were supposed to be competitors, walked across the stage and hugged the Hendersons. The line between game and life had dissolved completely. But Steve wasn't done. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. Right there, on live television, he broke another rule. He stopped the game entirely and said, Patricia, I want you to have my personal number. Not my agent's number. Not my assistant's number. Mine. Because your son was right. You're gonna laugh again. And whenever you need someone to remind you of that, you call me. He wrote his number on a piece of paper, folded it, and placed it in her hand. Then he did something even more unexpected. He took off his suit jacket, the one he wears in every episode, his signature look, and he draped it over her shoulders. This is from Michael, he said. He's telling you he's proud of you. He's telling you you kept your promise. And he's telling you that joy is still yours to claim. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Steve Harvey, giving away the jacket that represents his authority, his role, his image. Giving it to a mother who had lost everything. It wasn't a publicity stunt. It wasn't planned. It was a human being recognizing another human being's pain and responding with the only thing that matters, presence. They never finished that game. The episode that aired would be edited, shaped, and crafted into something that honored both the format of the show and the sacredness of what happened. But everyone in that studio that day knew they had witnessed something that transcended entertainment. They had seen what happens when someone chooses compassion over protocol. When someone chooses humanity over ratings. In the weeks that followed, the impact of that moment rippled outward in ways nobody could have predicted. The clip was viewed over 50 million times. But more than that, it started conversations. Grief counselors began using it in therapy sessions. Churches played it in sermons about compassion. Teachers used it to talk to students about empathy. Patricia Henderson received thousands of messages from other grieving parents. She started a foundation in Michael's name that provides support for families dealing with childhood cancer. And true to his word, Steve Harvey stayed in touch. He called her on Michael's birthday. He sent flowers on the anniversary of his passing. He invited her back to the show, not as a contestant, but as a guest, to talk about her foundation. But perhaps the most profound impact was on Steve himself. In interviews after that day, he spoke about how that moment changed him. "I've been in entertainment for decades," he said in one interview. "I've made people laugh, I've won awards, I've had success. But nothing, and I mean nothing, has ever felt as important as the moment when I stopped being Steve Harvey the host, and just became Steve, a man standing with another human being in their pain." He began incorporating more moments of genuine connection into his shows. Not manufactured drama, but real space for real stories. He started a segment called More Than a Game, where families could share what brought them to the show, what they were carrying, what they were hoping for. And he made it clear to his producers, if a moment like Patricia's ever happens again, we stop. We honor it. We choose people over production schedules. The jacket he gave Patricia still hangs in her home. She's never washed it. It still smells faintly of his cologne. And next to it, she's hung a photo that an audience member took that day. Steve with his arms around her. Both of them crying. Both of them human. Both of them connected by the invisible thread of loss and love that binds us all. Michael's final words, "Mom, promise me you'll still laugh," became a mantra for Patricia. But they also became something more. They became a reminder that grief and joy are not opposites. That we can honor those we've lost by continuing to live. That laughter is not a betrayal of memory, but a celebration of it. And Steve Harvey, the man who has made a career out of making people laugh, learned something that day that he carries with him still. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop trying to entertain and simply stand with someone in their truth. Sometimes the best joke is no joke at all. Sometimes the only thing that matters is showing up as a human being for another human being. The legacy of that day lives on in every person who saw that clip and felt permission to grieve openly. In every parent who felt seen in their loss. In every person who realized that vulnerability is not weakness, but the most courageous thing we can offer each other. And in the reminder that television, at its best, is not about escape. It's about connection. It's about recognizing ourselves in the stories of strangers and realizing we're not strangers at all. Years later, Steve would say in an interview that he keeps a photo from that day in his dressing room. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. "Every time I walk in there to get ready for a show," he said, "I see Patricia's face. I see her pain. And I remember that none of this matters if we forget we're dealing with real people, real stories, real lives. That day taught me that my job isn't just to make people laugh. It's to make space for them to be human." Patricia keeps that piece of paper with Steve's number in a locket around her neck. She's only called it twice. Once on what would have been Michael's 20th birthday. Once on the first anniversary of his death. Both times Steve picked up. Both times he listened. Both times he reminded her of what her son knew all along, that her laughter is a gift, not just to herself, but to everyone who needs to be reminded that joy can coexist with sorrow. That life continues even when we think it can't. That love doesn't end when life does. This is what Steve Harvey's legacy will ultimately be. Not the jokes. Not the ratings. Not the awards. But the moment he chose to be human first. The moment he showed millions of people that the most powerful thing we can do is acknowledge each other's pain and say, without words, "I see you. Your pain matters. Your story matters. You matter." Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Michael's final words echo forever. "Promise me you'll still laugh." And on that Family Feud stage, Steve Harvey showed us that sometimes the greatest act of humanity is simply choosing to stop everything and stand with someone in their pain. That's not entertainment. That's love.